The United Nations Hall was buzzing with anticipation, cameras flashing from every angle, and the eyes of the world glued to the stage. World leaders, diplomats, and journalists filled the grand chamber, waiting for what had been billed as one of the most important debates of the decade. Former President Donald Trump had taken his seat with his signature defiance, his jaw set, his red tie almost like a flag of war against his critics. On the opposite side, Denzel Washington, respected not only as a legendary actor but as a powerful voice of conscience, prepared to speak. This was no Hollywood script, this was a real confrontation, broadcast live across the globe. The question hanging over the chamber was simple yet seismic: what did America stand for in the eyes of the world? Trump adjusted the microphone, smirked at the crowd, and declared that his leadership was unmatched, his policies the savior of the nation. Murmurs spread through the audience, some applauding, others shaking their heads. Then came Denzel's turn. He rose slowly, his presence commanding, his voice carrying the weight of truth and moral fire. With the world watching, he fixed his gaze on Trump and said words that would echo like thunder: "You don't deserve this country." Gasps filled the room, cameras zoomed in, and in that instant, history was made, not in the corridors of power, but in the raw clash between integrity and arrogance. The United Nations General Assembly Hall was more tense than usual, every seat filled, every camera pointed at the stage. Delegates from across the globe whispered in anticipation, aware that what was about to unfold could echo far beyond these walls. On one side of the long polished table sat Donald Trump, his posture rigid, his face locked in that familiar scowl that mixed confidence with defiance. On the other sat Denzel Washington, not a politician, but a voice the people trusted, a man who had come to embody truth spoken to power. The contrast between them was striking: Trump's restless energy versus Denzel's steady, unshakable calm. The moderator's introduction was brief, almost unnecessary, the tension in the room already carried its own weight. Then came the moment. Denzel leaned forward, his hand resting on the microphone, his eyes scanning the assembly before fixing squarely on Trump. His voice cut through the silence like a blade: "Mr. Trump, this stage is not about you. It is about accountability, about what kind of world we are leaving behind. People are still waiting for answers, not slogans, not spin. Real answers." The words hung heavy in the air. A murmur rippled across the audience, delegates exchanging glances, some nodding, some bracing for Trump's inevitable eruption. For a brief moment, the hall felt less like an international forum and more like a courtroom, with the entire world as the jury. Trump's response came fast, his voice louder than necessary, filling the chamber with an energy that felt less like leadership and more like desperation. Accountability? I've done more for this country than anyone in this room could imagine. I stood strong when the world was weak, I defended America when others wanted to bow. Don't lecture me, Denzel, you're an actor, not a statesman. His words rolled out like thunder, his fist tapping against the table for emphasis. But rather than rattling him, the outburst only seemed to sharpen Denzel's focus. He did not flinch, he did not raise his voice. Instead, he let the silence stretch for a second longer than comfortable, as if giving Trump's fury space to collapse under its own weight. Then, he spoke again, his tone even and deliberate. "This isn't Hollywood, Mr. Trump. This is humanity. You speak of strength, but true strength is not in dominating the weak or shouting the loudest. True strength is in standing for justice, even when it costs you." The effect was electric. Delegates leaned forward in their seats, pens paused above notepads. Cameras zoomed tighter, hungry for the clash unfolding before them. Trump, visibly unsettled, leaned back, his jaw tightening as if to bite down on the silence. Denzel pressed further. "You talk about defending America, but tell me, do you defend all Americans, or just the ones who cheer your name? Do you defend peace, or only power? Because the world is watching, and history doesn't forget." The hall erupted in whispers, some delegates clapping softly despite the formality of the setting. Trump's face reddened, his hand gripping the microphone like a weapon he could barely control. The tension was no longer confined to the table, it had spilled into the very air of the assembly, charging it with the raw energy of confrontation. Trump leaned forward, his voice dropping into a growl that carried more menace than authority. "Don't stand there and pretend you understand what it takes to lead. You read lines, I make history. I don't need lectures about peace from someone who's never sat in the chair of power." His words dripped with disdain, and he gestured dismissively toward Denzel as if swatting away a nuisance. But Denzel didn't blink. His composure was almost unnerving, the calm of a man who knew that patience could slice deeper than rage. He clasped his hands on the table, leaned slightly forward, and spoke with the gravity of someone who had carried truths heavier than applause. "Power without conscience isn't leadership. It's tyranny. And history has never been kind to those who mistake fear for respect." The phrase hung in the room like smoke after an explosion. Delegates exchanged looks, journalists scribbled furiously, and the cameras captured every flicker of Trump's reaction. His lips pressed into a thin line, his knuckles widening on the microphone. Denzel continued, each word carefully measured. "You claim to defend America, but you forget, America isn't just a flag. It isn't just a stage for your victories. It's people. Millions of people who trust their leaders not to trade justice for applause, not to sell peace for politics. And when those people look at you, Mr. Trump, they don't see a defender. They see a man who uses their hope like a tool, and their fear like a weapon." For a moment, even the usually restless journalists were still. The power of the word seemed to settle into the marble walls, into the flags hanging heavy above the chamber. Trump shifted in his chair, his anger visible, but Denzel's voice carried on like a steady drumbeat. "If you want to shout, shout. If you want to threaten, threaten. But understand this, history isn't written by the loudest man in the room. It's written by the one who dares to speak the truth when others stay silent." The audience erupted, not with applause, but with something more powerful, the unmistakable hum of a world realizing it had just witnessed a line in history being drawn. Trump slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like a gavel across the chamber. "Truth? Don't lecture me about truth. I've built an empire, I've run a nation, I've stood against enemies you can't even imagine. You want to preach? Go back to Hollywood." His face was flushed, his words tumbling out in rapid bursts, each sharper than the last. But Denzel's eyes never wavered. He didn't meet Trump's fury with equal fire. Instead, he wielded silence like a blade, letting the former president's words spiral into the heavy air. When he finally spoke, his tone was deliberate, each syllable cutting deeper than Trump's roar. "Empires crumble when built on lies. Nations fracture when leaders confuse their pride with their people's survival. And Hollywood? Hollywood tells stories. But here," he gestured at the chamber walls, at the rows of delegates watching in absolute silence, "here is where the real story is being written. And history has no editor to save you." The cameras zoomed in. Every network carried his words, every screen lit up with Denzel's calm defiance. Trump supporters in the audience shouted, some jeering, but their noise only made the contrast sharper, one man raging, the other anchored in unshakable resolve. Denzel leaned forward now, breaking the space between them. His voice dropped, no longer booming but intimate, like he was speaking only to Trump though the entire world listened. "You've confused domination for leadership, Mr. Trump. You've mistaken fear for loyalty. And when a leader fears losing power more than failing his people, he's already lost both." The chamber erupted, journalists firing questions, diplomats murmuring to one another, the buzz of history unfolding in real time. Trump sat back, jaw tight, his breathing heavy. For once, the master of spectacle had no script to follow, no crowd to manipulate. Denzel didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat, didn't deliver a final blow. He simply stared at Trump, letting silence become the sharpest weapon of all. And that silence spoke louder than any headline could. The silence in the chamber was electric, the kind that made even the flicker of camera lights feel deafening. Trump, restless in his chair, tried to gather himself. He adjusted his tie, leaned into the microphone, and forced a smirk. "You talk a good game, Denzel. But let me remind you, this isn't a movie. This is the real world, and in the real world, strength wins. Always. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying more than he wanted the audience to hear. Denzel tilted his head, his expression calm but firm, almost surgical in its precision. Strength without justice isn't strength. It's bullying. And America was never meant to be ruled by bullies. The words landed with the force of a hammer, each delegate leaning forward as if drawn by gravity. Trump chuckled bitterly, attempting to regain control, but Denzel pressed on. His voice grew steadier, louder, his cadence deliberate, as if speaking not just to Trump but to every person watching across the globe. You think leadership is about winning battles and humiliating opponents. But leadership is sacrifice. Leadership is standing up for those who can't stand for themselves. Leadership is knowing that sometimes, the hardest choice is the right one, not the popular one. The room was no longer neutral ground, it had become a stage for truth versus ego. Trump's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Even some allies in the chamber struggled to meet his eyes. The narrative was slipping from his hands, and he knew it. Denzel leaned closer, lowering his tone into something almost intimate, yet audible to millions watching live. History doesn't remember the loudest voices, Mr. Trump. It remembers the ones who chose integrity over applause. And when your chapter is written, what will it say? That you fought for the people, or that you fought only for yourself? The question cut through Trump's smirk like a blade. For the first time, he had no immediate comeback. His silence was louder than any words he might have mustered. The world watched, breath held, as the tension spiraled into something unforgettable, a defining confrontation where one man's fury collided with another man's truth. Trump's silence lasted only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat the entire chamber seemed to shift. Delegates leaned forward, journalists' fingers hovered above keyboards, and cameras zoomed closer as if waiting to capture history in real time. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Trump slammed his hand against the table. You think you can lecture me? I built this country's success. I made America respected again. Without me, this nation would have crumbled. His voice rose, echoing through the hall, every word dripping with defiance. The outburst drew gasps, but Denzel didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded, eyes locked on Trump with a calm that made the former president's fury seem almost desperate. When Denzel finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, yet sharp enough to slice through the roar. Respect isn't fear, Mr. Trump. What you call strength, the world calls intimidation. And what you call loyalty, the people call manipulation. The hall erupted with murmurs. Some nodded firmly in agreement, others exchanged wary glances. Denzel's words carried the weight of something undeniable, not political strategy, but raw truth. He leaned forward slightly, his tone rising. Leaders are tested not by how they treat the powerful, but by how they treat the powerless. And time and again, you've chosen to crush the weak while bending to those who already have too much. Trump scoffed, rolling his eyes, but the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his jaw tightened, and though he tried to mask it with bluster, the audience could sense it. Denzel was pulling him into a corner from which there was no easy escape. Denzel delivered the next line like a final blow. America doesn't need another king on a golden throne. It needs a servant willing to carry its burdens. The word sent a chill through the room. Delegates whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between the two men as if watching a duel where truth itself was the weapon. And in that moment, for the first time in the night, the power dynamic shifted unmistakably. It was no longer Trump commanding the stage. It was Denzel, steady, unyielding, and armed with nothing but conviction. Trump leaned back in his chair, the weight of Denzel's words pressing down on him like an invisible hand. He scanned the room, searching for an ally among the delegates, someone who might nod in solidarity or give him the reassurance he craved. But what he saw instead was a sea of watchful eyes, eyes that judged, measured, and silently condemned. The silence was unbearable, so he broke it with bluster. You don't understand power, Denzel. Power is about survival. It's about doing whatever it takes to win. That's what America has always been, a winner. And I made it win again. His words thundered through the chamber, but they lacked the spark of conviction. They sounded hollow, defensive, like a man desperately clinging to a story no one wanted to buy anymore. Denzel waited, letting the echo die before speaking. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His calmness made every word land harder. Survival at the cost of principle is not victory. It's surrender. And America didn't become great by surrendering its soul. His tone grew firmer, sharper, each phrase cutting deeper. You measure greatness in towers and applause. I measure it in people who can sleep at night knowing they stood for something real. A wave of whispers rippled across the hall. Delegates from nations that had often felt the sting of Trump's policies exchanged glances, some even clapping softly before quickly silencing themselves. The tension grew unbearable, as if the entire chamber was suspended between collapse and explosion. Trump shifted again, his face flushed, his breathing heavier. But Denzel leaned closer, seizing the moment. The world is watching, Mr. Trump. And history is recording. Ask yourself, when this moment is replayed tomorrow, next year, or 100 years from now, will people see a leader who lifted his nation up, or a man who dragged it down to feed his own pride? The words didn't just strike Trump, they struck the entire room, the cameras, the millions watching live. A single truth became inescapable: this wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning. The reckoning grew heavier with every second, as if the walls of the UN chamber themselves leaned in to hear what would come next. Trump clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the table. He leaned into the microphone, his voice rising, almost shaking. You think you're the voice of the people? You're an actor, Denzel. A performer. You don't know what it takes to lead a country, to fight for survival when the world is against you. His words were laced with venom, but behind them, cracks of insecurity widened. Denzel didn't blink. His stillness was unnerving, a quiet strength that made Trump's anger feel small. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, and spoke with the authority of someone who carried not a script, but conviction carved from experience. You're right about one thing: I'm not a politician. I'm not here to play games of power. But maybe that's exactly why the people listen. Because I don't need their votes, I just speak their truth. Gasps echoed through the chamber, some muffled applause quickly suppressed by the moderator's nervous gavel. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, red, tense, lips pressed tightly together. He tried to interrupt, but Denzel pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. Leadership isn't about titles or crowns. It's about service. And you, Mr. Trump, have confused serving yourself with serving the people. The words cut deep, and even Trump's staunchest defenders in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension was suffocating. Denzel leaned back slightly, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. History won't remember your rallies. It won't remember the insults or the showmanship. It will remember the lives you failed to protect, the truths you tried to bury, and the silence you demanded from those who dared to question you. For the first time, Trump looked cornered, his confidence faltering. And the world, watching live, knew that no amount of bluster could undo what had just been said. The moderator's gavel struck again, but it was powerless against the storm inside the chamber. Every eye stayed locked on the stage. Trump shifted in his seat, searching for words, for an angle, for the bravado that had carried him through countless confrontations. But the silence that followed was heavier than any speech he could give. Then Denzel leaned forward for the final time, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall, amplified not just by the microphone but by the gravity of the moment. Mr. Trump, you call me an actor. Maybe I am. But here's the difference: actors tell stories to reveal the truth. You tell stories to hide it. The words echoed like a verdict, final and damning. Gasps filled the chamber. Some delegates actually stood, unable to contain their shock, while others whispered furiously into phones, knowing headlines were already being written in real time. Trump tried to respond, his lips parting, but no sound came. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of every accusation, every denial, every hollow defense had finally come crashing down at once. Denzel didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply looked at Trump with that same calm, unyielding gaze, then turned slightly to the delegates. The world deserves leaders who understand that power without principle is corruption. And America deserves better than a man who confuses loyalty with submission. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a collective recognition that something historic had just happened. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building into a thunder that filled the vaulted ceiling. Cameras flashed, journalists scrambled, and millions watching at home felt they had witnessed a mask torn off in real time. Trump sat back, visibly shaken, the applause washing over him like a tidal wave he could no longer control. For once, he wasn't the center of the spectacle. He was the subject of it. And as Denzel stood, his calm presence towering above the noise, the message was undeniable: truth had spoken, and it had left power trembling. What happened here today wasn't just a clash between two men, it was a warning echoing at the very heart of democracy. The voice of the people stood tall against the shadow of unchecked power. Denzel Washington's words didn't just strike Trump, they shook the entire world. Truth cannot be silenced, and masks cannot be worn forever. This moment won't go down as just another debate, it will be remembered as the night truth stood victorious over arrogance.